Hi, everyone. Welcome to the session. We are eager to have you here for the Indigenous Engagement in Systemic Finance session. We have Suzanne joining us from Cattile Strategy, Wembridge from Wembridge Consulting, and Jason Jacobs from Money Consortium. Please share it in the chat. Who are you? Where are you logging from the world today? And what are you hoping to gain from the conversation today? So I'll leave the floor for Jason now to give us an introduction. And Susan, you can share the slides.
Yeah, kia ora everyone. Tihei mauri ora. Tu tawa mai i runga, tu tawa mai i waro. Tu tawa mai i waho, tu tawa mai i roto. Kia tau ai te mauri tu, te mauri ora ki te katoa. Tera pē kia whakamohiotanga e koe o uranga pono. Haumi e, hui e, tāheki. Thank you everyone for being present today. We summon from above, below, within, from the outside environment, to calm and settle the vital inner essence, the well-being of everyone. May your awareness open up your true existence, be joined here together today, united as one. It's a pleasure to have you all here. I wanted to bring you all in together. It's an old karakia that was developed by one of my relatives in terms of the whole balance of the things we'll be talking about today. So it's so wonderful to have you all present, and I just wanted to give you time to check in and make sure that you're all being able to address your parts and what you're coming to be here today, because this is our opening the fire. Indigenous Commons, an initiative born of Catalyst 2030 from a young man called Teku and Suzanne, who's here with us today. And so reimagining economy starting with the concept of value. So I'd like to bring up the next slide, if you may, Karen. Yeah, so obviously this is one of our Indigenous Commons guardians. She hails from the Nigeria region, and this statistic, as you would see, 80% of the world's biodiversity is located in Indigenous territories. And here we have Emin here with her people and on the land. And one of the other points that a lot of people overlook is that 6% of the world's people are Indigenous that contribute to that 80% of biodiversity. And in terms of the value that we bring in, it's just wonderful to have the two people that will be speaking more today around these important factors. As you can see here, there's some of the guardians that are part of the Indigenous Commons, and we're a collection of Indigenous communities in all the continents, and these are some of the beautiful souls that are contributing their time, energy, and value to providing new and ancient informative ways of working together as communities. So I just wanted to allow you all to understand that everyone today, it's been wonderful, actually. I had forgotten that I should be thanking our Catalyst 2030 community for allowing us to place Indigenous Commons, and it's just wonderful to be here. And we know that this is just the start for Indigenous Commons contribution to the universe in terms of how we can help provide a balance for all the dysfunction in the blockages for processes around the world. just in turn, I just feel the spirit in the spirit. I wanted to say we've got guardians here. So there's Gabriella in the top left, Emin, Dema, Fernando, as you can see, Gwen and Lydia represents some of our people from the north, and Amon also in Aotearoa, and Soleimani in the West Africans, and Bante from in Middle Africa, and Teku there. And so I'll just, next slide, please. I'm just, and before I move into the part of our storytelling parts, I just wanted to give you a brief little intro into two of our speakers today. They're giving their contribution and their energy. So firstly, we have Gwen Bridge. She's weaving finance with Indigenous wisdom, a respected leader from the Saddle Lake Cree Nation. Bridges the worlds of finance and Indigenous knowledge with over 20 years of experience. She guides First Nations in managing natural resources and protecting sacred lands. From collaborative conservation efforts to policy development, Gwen's excellence weaves together technical knowledge, traditional wisdom. She brings a spirit of understanding and love to Indigenous engagement with systemic finance, offering innovative solutions for a more inclusive financial future. And her sister guardian, Suzanne Bowles, she's weaving a new world with money as medicine. For over 2 decades, Suzanne has been a midwife to a new financial dawn. She empowers philanthropists, both seasoned and budding, to birth innovative funding models alongside grassroots organizations, from regenerative governance with Indigenous wisdom to transformative financing with Indigenous Commons and FEST. Suzanne weaves together money and meaning. Her passion, some would say, is helping mend the fabric of Western hearts and cultures, fostering a future rich in conscious generosity and deep listening. As she says, we grieve the old systems to make space for the new, unleashing potential yet unseen. Get ready, everyone, for a financial revolution with an energy source from our Indigenous fire and soul. I'll pass you over to Suzanne.
Jason, I'm so glad that was recorded. You made me sound so excellent. Thank you. Wow. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining. It's a wonderful moment for me. I was one of the founding members of Catalyst 2030 and the early incubation board, and I've been sticking around quite a bit, but also Indigenous Commons, as Jason mentioned, was an initiative that found its first leaders inside Catalyst 2030 in 2020. And just to give you a little sense of what was the imperative that we were experiencing, it was myself, having worked 20 years, committed to moving resources towards some of the most important grassroots movements on earth, and realizing that there is a dissonance between our global economic story, the theories of value that drive all of our financial and legal systems around the economy, and then what value really is in communities, right? So the notion that, for example, it's the forest that's valuable because it provides life. But in our global economic system, the only way we can find value is by logging or by extracting or taking wood, right? And so we're coming up with new ways, and it's this emerging field right now of how do we actually move money back towards the intact ecosystems, the entangled systems at the level of community that have to do with caring for children, caring for elders, these things that aren't seen as valuable because they don't match the story of value that was created a long time ago by just a few people. So this first slide actually is not in my voice. So the role that I take at Indigenous Commons is I'm what we call a kinship coordinator. So there's an important role for those of us who are maybe a few hundred years separated from our own Indigenous roots, those of us who care very, very deeply about planet Earth and maybe have lost some of the cultural connections that would make it possible for us to approach things from a lens of interbeing and interconnection and interdependence. And those of us who were very privileged in the existing economic system often have been so because we have been, playing the system that is the dominant system for a long time in our families. And there's a whole bunch of justice that's woven into that story, and liberation that needs to happen. But one of the things that I've been doing is I've been resourcing, supporting, connecting other folks who are more of my lineage or who have money to Indigenous Commons to actually support the guardians who are having these discussions, about 12 folks who are from different bioregions. Jason was pointing some of them out, who are actually going into these deeper questions of what is value? How might an economy that's run on Indigenous principles and practices be governed? What does it look like to actually move money back to life and land, and to stop making money dependent upon the destruction or the atomization of life and land? And so this first opening slide is really coming from a place that I'd love to just invite my collaborator, Gwen, who's been along on the ride with Indigenous Commons for a year now. Maybe Gwen, if you'd like to introduce and just share a little bit about Indigenous cultures and how story is important to Indigenous cultures, that would be so helpful.
Thanks, Suzanne. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Catalyst 2030, for inviting us. Thank you, Jason, for the opening. So story in my work is critically important for multiple reasons. Stories are the fundamental framework that Indigenous science or Indigenous peoples use to convey information about the earth around us, information about the behavioral obligations to each other, to other nations, and to the relationships we have with all the things that have spirit. In the Cree culture, most things are animate. The classification is between animate and inanimate. And so these stories reflect the knowledge of all the things that are in the earth. Those stories convey all of the information that's important to be held by the society. In oral societies, there was no written documentation. So everything was contained through orality, through oral knowledge transmission, through the holding of dynamic complexity within the brain and the ability to transmit that to future generations and apply that on the land. So there's a lot of momentum today to want to understand Indigenous knowledge, particularly through sort of a scientific interpretation. We want to include those things in technical reports and scientific research and things like that. But and that's done, but that's done as a means of communicating story to the other, from the Indigenous nation to the other, in a way that the other can understand, i.e. written formats. Indigenous story remains conveyed through this oral transmission, and it really has a legal component. The information within that story contains not only information about the world around us and our relationships, but the way that we're supposed to behave. So it has this particular legal authority to it that oral tradition in the Western conceptualization doesn't have. The things we say don't really matter unless they're written down on the Western side, that they're legally enforceable. My colleague Lauren Tarasket says, our word is our law, right? That the depth of commitment conveyed within the storytelling culture and the commitment to those oral transmission methodologies, again, has the sort of ecological component, what we're seeking in terms of what information will help us save the world. And it contains the behavioral obligations, i.e. law, for doing the things that are conveyed through protocols that are reflected in the story. And it contains the guidance for how we interact between each other. So story is really everything in Indigenous societies. And I think I'll conclude with that. Thanks, Suzanne.
Of course, perfect. Thank you so much, Gwen. And it's, in my role, what I'm trying to do is support the creation of the container by moving resources. Having worked now 20 years, building trust and understanding with a lot of the communities that are doing important work that otherwise is not understood by funders, by international organizations that are resourcing the most important work on Earth. So when Jason said 6% of the world's people are considered indigenous by somebody's measure, I'm not sure whose. The World Bank, by the way, says this. And 80% of the world's biodiversity, which is the measure of all life on Earth, which is absolutely critical to the survival of this planet, 80% of that is located in indigenous territories. It's not a coincidence. Within our community at Indigenous Commons, we're also speaking and beginning to collaborate with Tyson Yunkaporta, the author of Sand Talk. And what he says, which I love, one of his many quotes that he shared with us is, Indigenous knowledge is not a library, but a process of inquiry and observation embedded in sentient landscapes. It's a relational practice with the land and the story that Gwen described. So I'm here in a way to help puncture the veil of where money goes to support Indigenous lifeways. And that's part of what we're getting into when we talk about Indigenous approaches to systemic financing. We also know that Western systems, of which I am a very lifelong student, sometimes when you're in something, you're the fish in the water and you can't really see the water around you. Western systems are also maintained by attitudes and beliefs that started with and can be changed through stories. The stories that we tell about, oh, that'll never happen because there's not enough money for that, or people will never believe that, or the expectations we have around what's possible are very much informed by our mythologies in the West as well. And it makes it hard to see that entirely other ways of doing things already exist and are working, and in fact, may have been working since before the story of Western civilization gave rise. So the way that I like to refer to this is that our global economic system is built on a control mythology. So it's a kind of story that is constructed to maintain power for some at the expense of others. So there are control mythologies out there, right? Some of them are racist oriented. Some of them are oriented around money. Some of them are oriented around gender, but they're stories about the way that things are that ensure that some people can't be participating actively. So old stories about money and value are holding harmful patterns in place. This is what we see. This is our analysis on the existing financing and funding system, that there are stories about what's valuable. There are stories about what's meaningful. There are stories about what's science, and those largely dictate where the money goes. But when you scrape underneath the layers of those stories, you can find that those are actually rooted in social belonging, my desire as a funder to be seen as valuable by other funders, my desire as a policymaker, etc. Where do we find social belonging? It's in the mythologies around us and how we understand our identity and our power. So in order for us to break free from harmful patterns with our money, we actually need to go deep on our own identity and the stories that we're listening to as well. I just outlined a few different mythologies that are out there that are perpetuating the harmful patterns in resourcing this work. So one is that Indigenous science is either secondary or quaint or not important, when in reality, Indigenous science is the reason that Turtle Island, also known as North America, was a massive agroecology project when the settlers showed up on the shores. What they saw as beautiful virgin forest was in many cases the result of millennia of careful tending and relationship. A lot of that has been wiped away now, and it has to do with a lot of what we're facing in terms of climate instability. So because conservation funders often don't include Indigenous approaches to biodiversity, very little funding makes it to Indigenous peoples, but even less goes directly to Indigenous peoples to work their own capacity and learning. Oftentimes, the funding that's received is dictated towards a Western approach as well. This idea that there's not enough money, I think we can see that COVID blew that out of the water. When we experience a collective existential threat, all of a sudden there are trillions of dollars, right? But this mythology keeps movements like the ones that Gwen and I are often working with really stuck in aiming low. We have to cultivate a higher vision to go after the bigger dollars. And we also need the funders to shift, right? And to begin funding over longer periods of time, recognizing that systems changing work is going to take time. Lifeways building work is going to take time. And so we need to get out of short-term incrementalism in order to break free. The market will save us. I am not against the market. The market has an important role to play. But when you talk about what's considered valuable in Indigenous economies, if we try to overwrite that with an outside market logic, all that stuff around stories and social equilibrium and the role of elders, and very often the role of women as well, because oftentimes in Indigenous and Global South communities, women are the ones who haven't learned the colonizers' language. They're the ones who are doing the important hearth building work and the connection and economy work inside the communities, right? And so just overlaying the market is very problematic. And so trying to financialize Indigenous communities with the Western logic can be really dangerous. It could wipe out the last systems of biodiversity that exist. Expertise is needed. This is another control mythology. I mean, expertise depends on how you define expert, but folks who have been vetted through a Western system of academia and knowledge, often I'm one, right? We have good things to offer, but there's plenty of knowledge available in communities that is not being put into good use. Heroes in winning fights. This is so much the part of the philanthropic system and how it's a part of Western logic as well. We tend to be interested in individuals who have overcome. We like the storyline of a person who's saving their community. Those people are great and they're necessary. And we may even have some on this call. And also, we need to be moving into a place where resourcing is being seen for greater liberation. And when I say liberation, I'm talking about the potential that human beings have to offer in community with each other and in relationship with the place. And if we're always moving money directly to individuals who are in some position of power, they may be very good people, but they have blind spots, and we're reinforcing that top-down system of decision-making. When once upon a time, in many places, there was more of a collective value creation. There was the ability to make decisions collectively. So that's why at Indigenous Commons, we talk a lot about regenerative funding governance. How do we take the money that we could get and put into a system of liberation? And last, this idea that we need to hurry up. We've been hurrying up now since the environmental movement cracked its head out of the shell. Hurrying up is not working because we are not building into the deeper quality systems that need to be in place for sustained long-term human-led relational design. As long as there's an environmental effort coming in to my community that I just do something simple and I don't have to think about it, I'm not actually engaging with my own role in the system, right? So we need things that engage people more. All right, so the liberation story that's rising is Indigenous Commons. And this is recognizing that there are thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of existing stories of value all around the world that are still active, that are, you know, constantly like pushing to save themselves, their own cultural survival, and that there are pockets of value, islands of coherence, I like to say, that actually could use money towards doing their life ways, towards doing what actually translates as biodiversity. And Gwen, you're the one who actually brought me into this notion that Indigenous lifeways are biodiversity. I know you're going to be speaking your own presentation in a second, but I'd love to have you speak a little bit about that right here, if you're open to it. What do you mean when you say that?
I mean that we're in this conversation, I think, sort of thinking through the Indigenous role in biodiversity conservation, and you touched upon it, Suzanne. You know, Indigenous lifeways are the mechanism by which biodiversity is protected. It's the best mechanism for doing that around the globe. The World Bank report, and its referencing, makes this point that even in comparison to national parks around the world, those areas that have the opportunity to be under the management regime, if you will, of an Indigenous nation, have these outcomes which are so much better than any other place. And so in this conversation around biodiversity, which we'll talk about, and then biodiversity financing, the what am I trying to say? The mechanism by which biodiversity is achieved is Indigenous lifeway. And that Indigenous lifeway looks very, very different than what we consider to be management within the Western framework. We consider management within the Western framework to look something like someone with a degree or a technical diploma going out and managing or measuring something, reporting it to a policymaker, policy being made, and then someone else going out and continuing the cycle. So it's this really cycle like that, which in terms of value, those technical expertise and those policy making elements of the process are valued. They're valued with money, right? The Indigenous lifeway that actually creates the result, I would argue, and Indigenous people throughout the world argue, that that process of policy and sort of technical work does not create a result that's been very good. The management of colonial regimes is not very good. And so Indigenous lifeways are not valued in the same way that those mechanisms are. So that's really, I think, part of the work we're trying to do here is to say, okay, well, how do we shift that valuing of the thing that doesn't work to the thing that does work, right? And that we have that connection between the results and the mechanism much more tightly conveyed through the application of our values, i.e. money, to that process. Not sure if that got to what you were thinking, Suzanne, but that's a thought.
No, that was brilliant, Gwen. In relation to what you've just added value, I wanted to say, I know you've been closely looking at the number of funders in the UN system that are supposedly funding biodiversity. So could you tell us a bit more about what you've seen and you're experiencing and you're looking at?
Well, I learned last week, because I'm writing this chapter on transboundary policy options for the Continental Biodiversity and Climate Change Assessment, which was mandated by the US Congress. That'll be out next year. But in that conversation, I learned that there were 160 different biodiversity financing mechanisms at the United Nations. That's overwhelming for anybody, I think, but particularly for Indigenous peoples. There's this whole momentum to move from extractive capitalism to conservation capitalism, and within that that set of opportunities, it's being framed under the conservation financing and biodiversity financing set of or sort of bucket. A lot of those funders, a lot of those proponents of these various initiatives are sort of making an assumption that many of these may be sort of quote unquote Indigenous led, which is a North American term that may not have global resonance, but that Indigenous people will be responsible for the application of some of these financing mechanisms, or they will be the beneficiaries of these financing mechanisms. There's lots of opportunity. One of the biggest gaps that I'm finding in my work in North America in particular is that Indigenous peoples are moving through these conversations with very little input into the construction of the mechanism from their own economic theory, if you will. And then secondly, very little expertise about the financial machinations of some of these financial mechanisms. And so when people want to fund these initiatives, it's a little like a snowball, right? You ask an Indigenous person, well, should we preserve biodiversity? What are they going to say? No, right? But when they say yes, it kind of subsumes them within this assumption that they're bought into an agenda which is oriented around biodiversity. Biodiversity is what? Biodiversity is a number of species, right? And that is not necessarily an Indigenous conceptualization of biodiversity, right? Indigenous understanding of biodiversity is like we're saying all my relations, all the relationships between the animate and inanimate things that move through the spirit of the world, right? And to be able to, so there's a big discourse that I'm trying to be part of, is to say, okay, biodiversity is not a bad thing, but it's not an Indigenous concept, right? And so when people say we're going to do all this biodiversity financing mechanisms, for me, I'm a little concerned that this sort of assumption about the goodness of biodiversity and that everyone would want to be bought in is almost like it's a little bit of an assimilation journey. I'm a little bit on guard for like, oh, we're all protecting biodiversity now, but we're not protecting the unique understandings and relationships that are conceptualized through Indigenous languages that are applied in situ. So I think I'll sort of stop there. Jason, thanks for that question.
I love that, Jason, and it brings me back to the very first slide, which is that the systems that we build are informed by the stories of our culture. And so if we're building a financing system that is coming from a Western cultural mindset, but trying to present something for what might be many diverse Indigenous perspectives, we're probably starting at the wrong starting point. So that's why at Indigenous Commons, we're talking about this idea of a kinship fund. And the kinship fund would be governed according to Indigenous principles and practices, and would be, governed towards multicultural bioregional movements, but understanding that the principles and the practices under how the financing is set up, and what is considered priority, what is considered valuable, is going to be like vastly different given the stories and the understanding of relationships with the land, and will differ over the range as well. And that's, and so what does it look like for us to actually create something that can provide a planetary system of reciprocity and exchange? We go first, this is what I was talking about earlier, it's kind of just the control mythology of value, right? The global economy is based on policies and legal agreements. They're all from a theory of value that was created by a subset of Europeans hundreds of years ago. That doesn't mean that those are all bad. It's just a time and a place that's very specific. It's before we started to hit some of the critical planetary thresholds. It's before most people had a reason to think that we needed to pay for reproductive labor and care, that these things were essential, but they were considered a given, right? And so it was a wildly successful endeavor on the part of those who created that theory of value, who were primarily settling other places at the time. It's a growing industrial and colonial context. What does that mean that is now the driving logic behind our global economy? So what we've done is we believe in actually moving out of reformist notions that we're going to tinker the system from within, recognizing that the system is built on stories, and enacting and performing alternatives. These are the islands of coherence. And the reality is that there are already thousands of places, some Indigenous, some local peoples, some, just anchored in place, that are already active in their own ways of identifying value. If you live in a community where people do things for each other, you're exchanging value, right? If you're in a connected community. So it's not that this is exclusive to Indigenous peoples, but having it be informed by Indigenous worldviews first centers those who have been pushed to the periphery of the current story into making the new story. So this stream is what came out of the first year of minimal resourcing to Indigenous Commons. We were able to scrape up like 2 funders who were like, I think I understand what you're trying to do. And we're working on that bridge still. I think we're doing well. And we want to entertain those notions with others as well. But what does it look like to have an Indigenous informed theory of value? So this is what the Indigenous Commons came out with as a starting point. And it's that value is created or liberated in the collective of all life. It is an ongoing and relational practice. It is not a practice of measuring and counting things, although measuring and counting things can be important at certain times. And in order for value to be created in the collective, certain conditions are put in place. And those could be spiritual space, could be sacred space, could just be the space to actually be able to come in together, the time to get and see what's important, and not just jump to the first idea of what we need money for, but to actually see what's around us, to actually have reciprocity, to realize, oh, you needed, roofing tiles and I needed fertilizer, and we don't both need to go to the store. We can actually, there's a lot that's here around us when we start to have those discussions. And then the energy of what happens in reciprocity is that we create a collective value. We start to realize that we're powerful together. And that happens in relationship with the humans, but also the non-humans, right? We are in relationship with the plant life and the animals. And how are we creating value together? I notice the bird that wakes me up every morning. That's an important function. And then we have, once we're in this system where we can see everything much more clearly, then we can really understand and put attention towards what is mine to do. It's no longer that I have to be told my job is to get married and have 2 kids and have a house and go to work. It's that I now can feel in the collective the energy of what is mine to do. And it may be dictated by protocols, it may be dictated by spiritual space. But it's not until after all of that is achieved that we should be talking about money, except insofar as we want money to actually enact the conditions to practice the stream, right? Money should come in when we've recognized the value that's there and what is needed and what we need to put our attention to. If money's coming in as the first conversation, like it does with so many funding opportunities, the first thing that happens is people want the money. And we miss all of the creation of all the other value. And that is so habitual now to our global economic and development systems. So we consider wealth to be the strengthening of the relationships along the banks of the stream as the stream continues to flow. And this is where I get to hand it over to Gwen.
Great. Thanks. So I talked earlier about this framing of this sort of trajectory, at least through some of the Indigenous conceptualization that I work with my colleagues, both in Indigenous Commons and beyond, to move from that extractive capitalism to the conservation capitalism to the systemic reform that we're beginning to envision that would allow the stream to flow, if you will, right? And so this we're in this thinking about, well, what is that systems change, right? So the Indigenous some of the Indigenous economic theory and economic practice that emerged from Turtle Island in particular, those that I'm most familiar with, involve this consideration of wealth as something that you give away, right? This is a strongly Indigenous held value system from Cree culture, from coastal cultures, from other cultures across North America, at least, is that there's so in my work, like, well, what is the commonality between this? And I'm not an expert yet, or probably won't ever be in Indigenous economic theory. I think there's a lot of work that's been done. But in terms of how we guide policy to think through some of these economic considerations, we're thinking, okay, well, systems change from the Indigenous perspective would mean a move away from the individualism that underpins the thinking that wealth is something to be accumulated and then stored, right? Stored individually, stored corporately, stored societally, right? And to the understanding that wealth accumulation occurs. So those are two similar things. Wealth accumulation is something that occurs oftentimes when in Indigenous cultures we have giveaways, right? You give away the stuff, and that stuff first had to be consolidated, right? And so then that process of giving away the wealth is the measure of status within the society. And so that support and contribution to the well-being of the whole is part of what elevates your status in society. And so this is something that is really challenging to operationalize in the current economic system, because that wealth storing, if you will, is so deeply ingrained in an individualistic mentality, in that if you give it away, you will be harmed. You will no longer have opportunity. You will no longer have social standing, all of these kinds of things. So when Suzanne and I were doing a webinar follow-up presentation with our colleagues at Transcap, and they did a meeting in Boston where we both attended and shared some of these ideas, those peoples who are really wanting to develop a global agenda for systems change, and so moving beyond sort of the place we're exploring now, which is conservation capitalism, to whatever looks like after that emergence, the systems change stuff. And they were really thinking through some of the challenges that most characterize this situation right now, and that it was about individualism, right? So even those very wealthy people were thinking, okay, well, we need to be able to move beyond individualism, because it's the individualistic nature of our society which hurts us. Because if I give all my wealth away, I don't gain any status in our society because that next person gets it, or all this kind of stuff, right? And Suzanne was talking about, well, we're just sort of in a bit of a scramble sometimes for this money and resources. So to me, this idea, and that conversation that we were at in Boston was not informed by Indigenous understandings of economy, right? What made Indigenous nations thrive? Not just survive, but thrive. What were those economic regimes around trade, around status, around value that can inform this conversation about where we need to go next? There's a big gap in the space that's coming out of within these conversations that is needs to be informed by those Indigenous principles. So we went and we talked about some of these things. Pragmatically, it's very difficult because the underlying values around individualism that are entrenched in policy and corporate structures and constitutions and things like that is really difficult, because we set ourselves up for adversity when we're saying, okay, well, I'm going to try to do something different. And that's not supported by the rest of society. So next slide. Yeah, so out of these conversations where people are moving towards, moving through this process or beginning the process of conservation capitalism, and for me, I'm looking beyond that, and some of those who are involved in this conversation are looking beyond that. But what's happening now are some of these things, and I mentioned that there's 160 different biodiversity financing options that the UN has identified. I knew there was at least 20, but there's a lot more. Some of them include these types of things that are related to ancestral stewardship credits, related to this natural asset company conglomerate, kinship funds, these prevention derivatives, and social and green impact bonds. So there's a lot of momentum to beginning to think through what we could do to support biodiversity. Indigenous Commons and others are thinking about, well, what can we do specifically to move that value to these Indigenous lifeways? These are some potential mechanisms, and there needs to be more, I think, in terms of understanding the trajectory through this transition, which is saying, okay, we're going to utilize some of these mechanisms within this conservation capitalism layer, if you will, but always with a through thought towards what systemic change looks like, right? Because the fundamental question is, well, okay, can we continue to enact capitalism, even if it's conservation capitalism, which is grounded in these senses of individual gain through these economic mechanisms. So next slide. Yeah, so I think this articulates the gap that we have on the Indigenous side coming out of Indigenous communities about being able to articulate an economic rationale grounded in Indigenous economic theory and praxis, if you will, from their traditional cultures, what made societies thrive, and being able to articulate that through an economic rationale, which makes sense to someone who is really sort of navigating and controlling some of the movement within the capitalist regime. It's extraordinarily difficult to my understanding. I don't have an economics degree, but this is the gap that hits Indigenous nations every single time in terms of trying to get valuation for the application of their lifeways. So how we think about that Indigenous economic theory, yes, okay, we can have some of that understanding out of Indigenous cultures, but then how do we communicate what that would look like for the regime change within the systemic reform agenda, right, of moving through capitalism? And so yeah, I think that there's no easy answer to this. And I think, across multiple fronts, we talked about urgency previously. Across multiple fronts, we're really looking to be able to have those conversations together, right? With Indigenous communities and with our with the people who are thinking through how we examine these mechanisms for biodiversity protection, for example, within the current regime. It's an interesting set of work, and we were talking at this chapter that I mentioned on the climate change assessment, the continental assessment, right? We're looking at the nexus between climate change and biodiversity, and sort of what policy options could we advise to make or lay out for governments, right? And so we're having a conservation financing chapter in a subchapter within our chapter, right? And really to think about, well, how would we begin to communicate some of these concepts around value of money and value of economic process being in wealth redistribution rather than wealth accumulation. So I would just sort of think there that I would close on this note, which is kind of some of the sort of simplistic framing of the economic rules within Indigenous society. And I can't speak for everyone. I don't have a Pan-Indigenous framework, but I have some grounding in cultures. And this was reaffirmed at our discussions from those nations, which are across Canada. And one of the important values, one of the laws of many Cree culture or many cultures, including my own, is to share. Right, to share with one another, to share with the settler, to share with the other, right? It's really, really, really an important grounding, this law to share, right? So that we can all have benefit. And so I would just sort of close, I think, this portion or this section with that kind of statement, which brings all this complexity down into that understanding of Indigenous law. Indigenous laws are not that abstract. Right? There's not a 400-page policy manual that you need to implement that particular law, right? And so, how to bring that clarity of law and vision about what societies need to behave like into these sets of policy guidance is challenging. So, okay, is there anything else on the slide there? The next slide. Right, and so that's kind of wrapping up. Thanks for that.
Well, ngā mihi, Queen. I think it was a good time, wasn't it, Suzanne, to open up the fire to the ones that we have within the room. So I put in a question in there if anyone wanted to ask a question or place it with us. And yeah, and in the spirit of what Gwen had explained about the reciprocity, it's important if yeah, come up and say something and place it for us. If we can answer it, we will, and if we can't, in due time, we will. I see there's a question there, Suzanne. Would you like to bring that into the fray? In the chat box, is it from Gary?
Oh, I think it's just a comment. Thank you, Gary. Gary is a really interesting philanthropist on the African continent as well. Yeah. Oh, thank you, Gwen, and thank you, Jason. And of course, what we're running through in an hour today could be a weekend-long exploration. So realize you might be feeling your hair blown back on your head. But you can ask us any kind of questions about like even how Indigenous Commons is conceived. So some of the things Gwen was talking about in terms of, how do we tackle the issue of systems change on so many different levels, from policy down to enabling communities. Those are some of the things that we're actually getting into and exploring with Gwen's, she's her own consultant, but she also has Indigenous Engagement Institute. And then we have Tyson Yonkaporta and the Indigenous Knowledge Systems Lab, and our friend Nyawi Flores, who's got a group called Kinray Hub that's based primarily in the Andes Amazon region. We have several different leading edge Indigenous thinkers who are asking a lot of the same questions we are. So the motivation is there. And we have a plan that we're hatching out this year. But any questions around, and also what examples of finance mechanisms do you know of that, you've seen, or do you question? Anything you want to share? I can talk a little bit about some of what we're looking at. So we went quickly through this slide, which are 4 areas, funding pending, that will be going into an Indigenous-led inquiry around. And so we have the ancestral stewardship credits. This is a really interesting, eco-token based system that's backed by the dollar, that would move resources through layers of governance defined by the collective. So say Indigenous Commons decided money could be governed according to these principles and practices. This is what we consider a value. And then people engaging in the ancestral stewardship system could receive resources or even commoning funds to do lifeways work in their regions or other things that were considered valuable according to the collective. We've been chatting with folks at Full Spectrum Capital about this risky and dangerous emerging field of natural asset companies. Some of those notions have real drawbacks, monetizing nature to the interest of its long-term production of value. Good, we do have another question here.
Yeah, we got one from...
Curious about any direct relationships or discussions between UN working groups on Indigenous Populations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment. Any direct relationships between the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations? Gwen, this is a question for you. I think maybe you would know.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff, right? And I don't know it all. And I only very recently beginning to be sort of thinking through some of the United Nations work. But I would say that there was a meeting in Denver in February of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples around the just transition in the green economy. So I'm not sure about the policies for responsible investing, how they play into that at all. But I will say that from the understanding of what was happening at that meeting, where there was Indigenous persons engaging in these conversations at the UN Permanent Forum for Indigenous Peoples, that there's still a lot of need for more clear and specific policy perspectives and directives that emerge from Indigenous communities to guide the conversations around that. There's still sort of a defensiveness that emerges in these conversations from Indigenous peoples that, oh, things are not done right. Oh, you should do more. You need to implement this and all this kind of stuff. What is less common is specific guidance for the changing of the particular policies and regimes that would facilitate the changing of that direction and advancing that discourse from one that continues to recognize the harms and challenges that have happened and have occurred in relation to Indigenous peoples, including their ability to exercise economic sovereignty. And so that's when I talked about the gap in terms of what those things need to be on the economic rationale side is still very much apparent as Indigenous people advance into this conversation. And so those things are very interesting, but I'm not familiar with those specific linkages. Just recently that UN Permanent Forum conversation around the just transition, that how it would be, how Indigenous people are engaging in that, right? And so on the Indigenous side, there's some stuff like, there's a lot of pushback against carbon markets, right? And so biodiversity credit markets following this trajectory of carbon markets, they call it a false solution. A lot of those communities that were continuing, as I said, to move through a capitalist regime that's now just shifted from extraction to conservation. And so there's a diversity of opinion amongst Indigenous peoples, and many are saying, well, we want our piece of the pie. We want to get some economic valuation from those trees which are on our lands, et cetera, et cetera. And there's others that saying, well, if we do that, we're just perpetuating these models which have been exploitive, right, in the past. And so there's a whole lot of debate, and we need more discourse and development of rationale on the Indigenous side for sure.
Thank you, Gwen. Again, like there's so much nuance here. There's so much we could be talking about. And so that's that, referring to the natural asset company, for example, the idea that we've been playing with is what might it look like to make those into the future forecast valuations based on the market, but based on clean air, clean water, things that come as a result of an intact ecosystem that are in perpetual service to all life. And then lock those down as investable assets and turn them into a conglomerate that is governed by a plurality of Indigenous practitioners and stewards. Because those kinds of large assets we've been discussing with some folks at Full Spectrum Capital, they've been doing launching a fund that's like this. could be potentially like, could have an initial public offering, could be investable, and could be a place where, as those very basic, I mean, that's the question, right? Like, should we be commodifying air and water? Is that the right direction to go? Or can we use the shell of the old system as a vehicle to move the money towards the new system? You know, I guess the question is, what is the ultimate aim of the finance innovation that we're creating? Is it to maintain itself, or is it to transition us justly into the next system? So there's a whole lot to discuss here. And I think we're coming to the end of our time. Are there any other questions that folks want to ask? Because I would hate to dominate on the whole call.
I would just say there's some, I'm going to put in this email, and I'm not sure if you have one that you could add, Suzanne, but if in response to that, keeping sort of abreast of some of these conversations that are emerging from the Indigenous community around biodiversity and conservation finance, if you email info@indigengage.com, we'll put you on a list, which is in addition to activities that might be emerging, some of these ideas about how we can have these conversations from an Indigenous centric point of view about the Indigenous role within the conservation financing mechanism. So one of the things that I want to do is develop a North American scan, maybe not of all 160, but at least a few tens of the various different conservation financing mechanisms and where Indigenous people are actually leading in those conversations. What examples do we have so we can move more explicitly from this idea that Indigenous people are going to take these and run with it to like, okay, well, where are they? And then informing through perhaps a conference or something like that, the ability for First Nations and Indigenous peoples to choose amongst those. And I know, Suzanne, we've been talking a little bit about some of these other convenings of these conversations that could happen through things like the World Indigenous Economic Forum. So, but anyways, that's just an opportunity to sort of get some updates, at least from my organization side. But Suzanne also put her email there.
Absolutely. And we're, to answer some of the other questions just quickly, where we are right now at Indigenous Commons is that we just finished a pre-development and we're about to launch. And part of that launching is solidifying our governance system. And what that means is that my role will probably change to be something more of a kinship supporter. We have, I think I'm like the only non-Indigenous person involved, about 12 of us. Well, Bruni lives Global South. But basically the invitation here is that if you're interested in being involved, there are lots of different pathways to plug into that are just coming out right now. There's a kinship pathway for those of us who are coming from maybe more of a settler or Western orientation, who want to explore what it means to be in relationship with all beings, to find our own indigeneity and not maybe take somebody else's. How might we return to kinship? There is one specifically for Indigenous practitioners and leaders that's looking at what are the big field building questions that we want to be asking. There's the one that's around designing the finance mechanisms and doing a process of Indigenous co-design and inquiry. All of these we're looking at also in collaboration with others. In particular, Tyson has been advising us, Tyson Yunkaporta, and Gwen is involved, and right now we're resourcing it, so we're looking for funding. That's a big one, and the next couple of months are going to open up the gates for us, ideally. And how we engage with Gwen also at Indigenous Engagement Institute, and what kinds of things we collaborate on and where we're separate will also be finding its right footing in the next coming months. So yeah, feel free to sign up online to join us as well.
Brilliant. So, namahi Gwen, namahi Suzanne, and thank you everyone for being here. So I'm going to close it off for us. We've just got a minute or so, so I'm just going to do a blessing, which is actually allows you to go on with the rest of your day too. That's the beautiful thing of our Indigenous systems, always supporting us with well-being and love. And so here it is. Tihei mauri ora. Kia tau nā manakitanga a te mea naro ki rungo ki tēnā o tātou. Kia mahia te hua makihiki, kia toi te kupu, toi te mana, toi te aroha, toi te reo maui, kia tuturu, kia whakamaua, kia tina hui e tāhiki e. Loosely translated, let the strength and life force of our ancestors be with each and every one of us, freeing our path from obstruction so that our words, spiritual power, love, and language are upheld, permanently fixed, established, and understood. Forward together, together, united as one. Tu te mai nā iwi, tātou tātou e. Tu te mai nā iwi, tātou tātou e. Whai a te maramatanga, me te aroha, e ngā iwi, ki ako tāpatahi, ki ako tahira, tātou tātou e, tātou tātou e, hio e hi. Ngā mihi nui a te mau.
Kia ora. Thank you, everybody. Look forward to seeing you all soon. Yeah, thank you so much. And we'll see what we can do to send through the Catalyst 2030 system to all of you, this recording and other resources as well. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Catalyst 2030.
Thank you.